I was born and raised in Missoula, Montana, not far from campus. My grandma actually was a secretary for the athletic department for most of my childhood, which means when she retired in '88, she got season tickets to all of the sporting events. And so I grew up back in those days, basketball was the big popular sport, not so much football. So I grew up riding bikes on campus and going to football and basketball games and all that kind of stuff. So, not that I really thought I was going to attend the University of Montana, but really that we used to really accustomed to being around campus and on campus and all kinds of stuff. And so, sort of in my educational pathway, school really wasn't a priority for me most of through middle school and high school. It mostly was a means to be able to play soccer or sports. I did maintain good enough grades to keep my parents off my back and stay eligible to play sports. But other than that, that was really my only priority. I was really not involved in AP classes or really super involved in school. And then as I sort of progressed through high school, I had friends that were very academically inclined and were always in AP classes, and was not really, I would hear about all the work that they would do, and I actually have a twin sister who is very much academic, that her whole background is science and math, and she definitely got those brain cells over me. So I think moving through high school, I saw people very successful in school and still didn't really want much to do with it, but I did fortunately take my energy and excelled on the soccer field, and that's really was my priority and passion. Getting close to the end of high school, I started thinking about college, but really only in terms of like where I could play soccer. It wasn't really about any sort of academic pathway or really even thinking too much about degree field. Both my parents, my dad's was a counselor for his career and a juvenile probation officer. My mom's been in education her whole life. And so I kind of knew that I was going to go into a human service field, but never really thought too much about what. Psychology and stuff interested me. So when I started off graduating from high school, when I started my college career, I actually went to Spokane Community College and spent or actually there on quarters. I spent a quarter there playing soccer, and it really was not the experience that I was looking for. Playing college sports was, especially at a community college, it was more involved than I had anticipated. The best part of all of it was because quarters start later, there was a time when I was only playing soccer and not having to do school, and that was my favorite part of all of it. And then as the quarter came to an end and ski season was rolling around in Spokane, the skiing's terrible. I was like, I'm done with this, and really my motivation petered out. And so came back, enrolled at the University of Montana, which at that time entailed filling out a paper application and writing an essay. Started in that would have been January in 2000. Probably the first major roadblock I hit in college was the University of Montana has a centralized, it's called Grizz Central, where everything is housed, and basically it's financial aid and the cashier. And I remember standing in line to get all of the information from everything, and I got passed around. After standing in line 15 or 20 minutes in each line, I got passed around the entire sort of complex and then back to where I started. And I left so frustrated, I walked home and I told my mom, college just isn't going to happen for me. This is not, and was extremely frustrated in the experience. Took a little while to calm down. Fortunately, was a long break at that time at the University of Montana. And so that was how I started, and very frustrated. And then fortunately, my sister had already spent a semester here, and so she sat down with me and helped me pick out a lot of just general education required classes. And so I took some anthropology classes, RIT 101, and just some general classes that were not terribly academically rigorous, but definitely getting in. And I actually really found the flexibility within the college schedule much more appealing than sort of the droning on of showing up for each period at high school. I really enjoyed the free time between classes, and then being able to float the river and ski and do all of those things depending on how you structured your schedule. So I actually found it a lot more appealing. As I started through school, I was always kind of a path of least resistance student. I went for the classes that I found more enjoyable and interesting rather than more rigorous, and so I definitely avoided hard science and math classes. I saw my sister taking them and was like, no way. And then really gravitated towards psychology and social work, and had a phenomenal professor named John Spores at the time. And he was getting ready to retire, but was a phenomenal professor. And I took a class from him and was like, okay, I think social work is definitely where I can see myself working and with people, and more tangible, at least at that time, than social work or than psychology was. So really found it much more appealing in terms of the coursework, and I enjoyed the research, and I found the reading interesting, and so not as math and science heavy as the other classes. And then in terms of major roadblocks, I was very close to graduating and got very sick my senior year, to the point that like I was hospitalized for days. It was really not good. And at that time, I'd actually never met with an academic advisor at all. I had opened up the paper course catalog and had sat down and figured out what all of the requirements were and what the classes were, and then talked to friends about what the professors were like, and never met with an academic advisor until I got to my senior year and was very ill. And at that point, my academic advisor, and then I'd been doing an internship to fulfill the requirement for my degree, I was really sick, and I went to talk to them, and because I was actually in a wheelchair at the time. And I talked to my internship supervisor, and she, in terms of the requirements that she gave me, was actually making it more difficult to complete the internship, by tracking out all of my hours and like maintaining all of these records that I actually wouldn't have had to do if I wasn't sick. Then I went to my academic advisor, and he basically agreed with her and then piled more work on top of it. And so at that point I was super frustrated, was still very sick, and was ready to drop out of school and be like, this just isn't worth it. Like I can't do this. So fortunately I met with a guy named Charlie Wellingstein, who was still a professor in the social work department, and basically I kind of poured my heart out to him and was like, I'm inches away from not finishing this. So he sat me down and he was like, okay, so explain to me your advising and all this stuff. And I was like, I've actually never met with one. And like the color in his face dropped, and he was like, you're kidding me. And I was like, no, like I've always just done this myself. And so fortunately I squared things away with him. I switched advisors, and then I actually was able to take N grades for most of the things, and had a full year after I graduated to finish all of the coursework and practicum and internship, and it actually wound up being a good thing and then successful. And then beyond that, once I finished my bachelor's degree, I was like, I'm done. Like, I'm never getting a master's degree. That's not ever part of my problem. I fulfilled the obligation from my parents. I got a degree that I can work with people. And I was going to spend the rest of my career running around in the mountains, and that was what I was going to do. And then worked for about 5 years and started to realize that what I really wanted to do was be a school counselor. And then unfortunately, I realized that that requires a master's degree. So I waffled around for about 5 years before I finally got the courage up to take the GRE, which I did have to take twice, which was not fun. I do not recommend doing that. But then eventually was accepted into the counselor ed program, and did well in that program, really enjoyed it. Enjoyed the coursework. It's probably the one thing that I'm most proud of, is that I have a master's degree. When I was in any time during my college career, if you would have told me at 37 that I had a master's degree and worked in education, I would have laughed you out of the room. It was never part of my plan or my career goal. But now I'm here, and I'm at the University of Montana, and I love what I do, and it's been a great journey so far.